Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Let me start with something that's gonna annoy a lot of B2B marketers, and I'm okay with that. Most targeting frameworks today are basically cosmetics, right? They look precise on a slide, they sound intelligent in a meeting, and they make everyone feel like they're being strategic. But the moment you put them in real world, they kind of collapse, right? Because they are not built to answer the only question that matters: is this account really capable of moving right now? And I'm not saying this as an outsider throwing stories. I have lived these mistakes, and I'm sure as B2B marketers we have all lived it. You build the perfect ICP list, you pick the right 50 accounts, 60 accounts, 90 accounts, you match the firmographic, you check the budgets, you convince yourself that these are the ideal targets, right? And then you do all the work, right? Campaigns, outbound, sequence, content follow up, and nothing happens. Not because your ads were terrible, not because your inside sales or SDR is crazy, not because your product isn't good. It happens because you targeted account that looked right on paper but was frozen in reality. And here is the line that changes everything, right? Fit doesn't create pipeline, movement does. The reason sales ignores marketing leads, the reason pipeline feels random, the reason your best accounts keep going dark is because you are selecting accounts based on identity, industry, size, title, instead of selecting them based on actually what's happening inside the company this quarter, this month, right? 1,000 employees SaaS firm and 1,000 employee fintech can look identical in your CRM, but one is in the cost control after layoff and other just raised a series D and is ripping out the entire stack, right? Same ICP, completely different reality. Only one is going to buy. So in this episode, I'm going to give you something that is not yet another persona variation, not a prettier ICP slide, and definitely not empathy maps with better font, right? I'm going to show you a simple operating model. We can call it the context grid that lets you stop guessing and start making targeting decision like an operator, right? By the end of this video, you'll be able to look at a list of accounts and quickly separate them into these will move, these might move, and these will not move, no matter how hard we push. And here is the twist, and the part most people don't want to hear: the accounts you should chase are often not the ones your ICP tells you to chase. Let that sink in, right? Your ICP tells you who qualifies. The context grid tells you who converts. And once you see the difference, you can't unsee it. So let's build it. So here is where most GTMs get trapped. And the trap is subtle enough that most people fall into it without realizing. We've been taught to believe that if an account fits our ICP, the right size, the right industry, the right titles, then targeting is just a matter of execution. Better messaging, better ads, better sequences, more persistence. And if it doesn't work, the assumption is always that something downstream failed, right? But that assumption is wrong. The real problem is that fit is a static concept and buying is a dynamic process. Fit tells you what an account is, it tells you nothing about what an account is doing. And companies don't buy because they are a certain size or an industry, they buy because something has changed internally or externally that forces movement. Think about how ridiculous this gets in practice. You and your competitor can be targeting the exact same account with nearly identical messaging, and one of you wins the deal while the other gets ghosted. The usual explanation is timing. But timing isn't luck, timing is just context you didn't bother to map, right? What we call bad timing is usually just ignorance of posture. right? You are pitching growth to a company in a defensive mode. You are pushing innovation to a team that's frozen by budget cuts. You are selling transformation to an organization that doesn't even agree internally that there is a problem yet. And the reason personas don't help here is simple. Personas freeze time. They assume a stable buyer with stable priorities. In a world where priorities shift every quarter, power structure change faster than most marketing plans get approved. This is why I say personas and ICPs don't fail, they just stop too early. They answer the question, who should we look at? But completely ignore the harder, most valuable question. What state is this company in right now? Context is what fills that gap. Context forces you to look at things most targeting models ignore, whether money is flowing or frozen, whether leadership just changed, whether an incumbent vendor is deeply entrenched, whether the problem you solve is even recognized yet, whether the organization is structurally capable of making a decision in the next 30, 60, 90, 120 days, right? Once you start seeing accounts through this lens, something uncomfortable happens, right? You realize that a large portion of your top target list was never going to convert. Not because they were bad fits, but because they were structurally immobile, right? No amount of creativity, personalization or hustle was going to change that. And here is the flip side, right? The part that excites me. When you stop worshipping fit and start reading context, suddenly smaller, messier, less obvious accounts start lighting up. Accounts your ICP would have filtered out suddenly make sense, because they are in motion, under pressure, aligned internally and ready to act. That is the shift we are making in this episode. In the next section, I'm going to show you how to make this practical, not philosophical. By breaking context down into a simple grid, you can actually run your GTM on instead of arguing about personas in a conference room. So let's go ahead and build that grid. So let me be very clear about what I'm about to do here. I'm not going to give you a 12-dimensional framework with fancy labels that look impressive and dies the moment you try to operationalize it. Most GTM frameworks fail not because they are wrong, but because they are unusable under pressure. So the context grid is intentionally simple, almost aggressively so. It's built on just two questions, because in real GTM, only two forces dominate outcome. The first question is, what is this company's investment posture right now? Not last year, not generally, right now. Every company at any point in time is in one of three modes, right? They are either in expand mode, spending, hiring, experimenting, pushing growth, or they are in defend mode, protecting margin, reducing risk, justifying spend, or they are in freeze mode. Budgets are locked, decisions delayed, and everyone is afraid to move, right? This single distinction already explains why so much messaging fails. Growth stories die in defensive orgs, cost cutting stories get ignored in expansion phases, and no amount of clever positioning works when a company is frozen. The second question is just as important. How clearly does this organization understand the problem you solve? Not how clearly you understand it, how clearly they do. Some organizations are completely problem blind. They don't even agree there is an issue. Some are problem aware but still vague and confused. Some are actively exploring solutions, and some already have a defined approach and are choosing vendors. This is the maturity ladder, and most GTM teams collapse all four levels into one generic campaign, which is why everything feels noisy and ineffective. Now here is where the grid comes together. On one axis you have investment posture, expand, defend or freeze. On the other you have problem maturity, blind, aware, exploring and defined. That gives you a simple grid with 12 possible contexts, right? And each of these 12 cells represent a different buyer reality, which means it demands a different message, a different asset, a different sales motion. There is no universal best campaign. There is only the right move for the context the buyer is actually in. And this is why ABM so often fails. It personalizes the message but ignores the context. It changes the name and the logo but not the logic of what's being said. Once you map accounts onto this grid, targeting stops being opinion driven. You are no longer arguing in meetings about priority accounts. You're simply asking which of these accounts are in a posture and maturity state that make buying possible right now. That's when something interesting happens, right? Your list shrinks, your confidence goes up, and sales starts paying attention. In the next section, I'll show you how to actually place real accounts onto this grid using signals you already have. Not expensive tools, no guesswork, just disciplined observation of momentum, and that's where this becomes operational. Now, the moment I show this grid to practitioners and operators, I always get the same reaction, right? Okay, this makes sense, but how do we actually know where an account sits? And here is the right question, because if this turns into another subjective exercise, we have learned nothing. Here is the good news: you don't need more data. You need to look at the right signals in right order. This is where the 3 layers of momentum come in, right? And if you have been following the anti-persona series, this should start to feel familiar. First, you look at external pressure. What's happening to the company that forces change? New regulation, funding events, acquisition, public breaches, customer churn that hits the news. These are not interesting updates, they are stressors that push an organization out of equilibrium. External pressure almost always shifts investment posture, sometimes overnight. Second, you look at internal movement, leadership changes, sudden hiring bursts in one function, new task force, new RFP activity, tool migrations. These signals tell you where the organization is reorganizing itself to act or bracing to slow down. Internal signals are the fastest way to understand whether the company is in expansion, defense, or freeze. Third, you look at behavioral micro signals. This is where most teams stop paying attention because these signals are quiet. Repeat visits from the same company, deep content as consumption, documentation views, late stage questions showing up before sales has even spoken to them. On their own, each signal looks small. Together, they tell you where momentum is accelerating or stalling. Now, here is the critical part. You do not average these signals. You don't score them blindly. You use them to answer 2 specific questions. Has the company's posture shifted in the last 30, 60, 90 days? Has the organization's problem maturity progressed? If posture hasn't moved, don't force it. If maturity hasn't progressed, don't pitch ahead of them. Let me make this concrete. Imagine an account that fits your ICP perfectly. Great logo, right industry, but they just announced layoff, froze hiring, and the CFO joined last month. That's a defensive or a freeze posture. No amount of innovation messaging will land because their internal mandate is survival, right? Now take a smaller, less obvious account, right? New funding, new VP, job posting, around your category, engineers reading implementation doc. The account may not look perfect on paper, but it's in motion. That's where pipeline comes from. When you place accounts onto the grid using these signals, something shifts psychologically, right? You stop chasing, you stop convincing yourself, you stop arguing with sales. The grid doesn't care about opinions, it only reflects reality. And once you have accounts correctly placed, the next question becomes unavoidable. What do we actually do in each of these boxes. That's where most frameworks will fall apart. In the next section, I'll walk you through how each grid cell demands a different play, different message, different asset, and different sales motion, and why running one campaign across all of them guarantees mediocre results. Right? That's where the context grid turns into a playbook. Here is the part that usually makes people uncomfortable. Right? Once you build the context grid, you lose the excuse of saying we just need better messaging, because the truth is simpler and harsher. No single message can work across different contexts, right? And if you try to run one campaign across all of them, you're not being efficient, you're just being lazy. Think about it from the buyer's side. An organization that is actively expanding, hiring, and under pressure to grow is living in a completely different mental universe than one that is defending margin or frozen by uncertainty. Yet most GTM teams talk to both with the same narrative, just tweaked slightly for industry language. That's why everything feels generic, that's why buyers tune out, and that's why sales says these accounts aren't serious. The grid forces a discipline most teams avoid: context specific playbook. Let's start with investment posture, right? Because this is where most messaging breaks. If an account is in expand mode, they're looking for savings, they're looking for leverage, they want to know how you help them move faster, scale smarter, or gain an edge. Vision led narrative work here, strategic POVs work here, executive level outreach works here. You earn attention by showing you understand where they are going, not by talking about features. If an account is in defend mode, the same message will fail, right? These teams are under scrutiny, budgets are being questioned, every decision has a justification trail. Here growth talks sound irresponsible. What lands is cost avoidance, risk reduction, proof, credibility. This is where your evidence matter more than your ideas. And if an account is in a freeze mode, almost nothing works the way marketers expect. These teams aren't evaluating options, they are avoiding mistakes. The only viable play here is de-risking, wedge entries, and patient long game positioning, right? Pushing harder doesn't accelerate deals, it only kills them. Now layer problem maturity on top of that and the picture gets even more clearer. A problem blind organization doesn't need your solution, it needs a reason to believe there is a problem. Diagnostic content works here, contrarian insights work here, product pitches do not. A problem aware organization is confused, not convinced. They need clarity, benchmark, and language to align internally. An exploring organization needs comparison and pathways, not hype. A solution defined organization needs proof, deployment confidence, and procurement enablement. Here the mistake most teams make, they try to compress all of this into one best performing campaign. The grid makes that impossible, and that's a good thing. Once you see that each cell represents a different buyer reality, your job changes. You stop asking what's your message and start asking what's the next logical move for this context, right? And when you do that, conversion stops feeling random. In the next section, I'll show you how this changes your relationship with sales, because when you hand sales context instead of leads, something interesting happens. They start listening, right? Let's talk about the tension. No one wants to own. Sales doesn't ignore marketing because they're arrogant. They ignore marketing because most of what they receive is context free. From a sales point of view, a qualified account usually arrives with a name, a title, maybe a score, and zero understanding of why now, why this account, or what landmines exist inside the deal. So sales does what any rational team would do. They rely on instinct and past experience instead. And then marketing complains that sales isn't following up. The context grid fixes this by changing the unit of value marketing hands over. Instead of sending leads, marketing sends situational clarity. For every account that crosses the handoff line, sales gets a short, brutally practical context packet. Not a deck, not a narrative essay, just the things they actually need to win. First, why this account is moving now, what changed in the last 30, 60, 90 days that created pressure for them, what is the funding, what leadership shift, what external event. This immediately answers the why now, why should I care question, right? Second, what posture the account is in. Are they expanding, defending, or freeze, right? This alone tells sales whether to push vision, lead with proof, or slow the conversation down and de-risk. Third, where they are on maturity ladder. Are they still figuring out problem or choosing vendors? This determines whether sales educates, diagnoses, or closes. Fourth, who actually matters internally. Not just the signer, but the influencer, the blocker, and the late stage veto player. This prevents the most common failure mode, winning the demo and losing the deal. And finally, one clear landmine. The thing that will kill the deal if ignored. Procurement rules, data constraints, incumbent loyalty, internal politics. Sales doesn't need 10 warning, they need one that is accurate. When marketing hands this over, something subtle but powerful happens, right? Sales stop asking, are these leads real? They start asking, do we have more like that? That's the trust shift. Marketing is no longer seen as a volume engine, it becomes a decision support system for revenue. And here is the uncomfortable realization most teams have at this stage. They were never failing at execution, they were failing at context transfer. In the final section, I'll show you how to build and run this grid in under an hour. So this doesn't stay theoretical, and how to turn this into weekly operating cadence instead of another forgotten framework. So build your context grid in 60 minutes, right? Let me end this by making it practical, because if this stays intellectual, it's useless. You can build your first context grid in under an hour, no tools, no vendor, no consultants. Here is how. Pull up your top 50 accounts, not leads, not MQL, not engaged account, the ones your business actually cares about. For each account, answer 2 questions. Don't overthink it. First, where is the investment posture right now? Expanding, defending, frozen. Second, how clearly do they understand the problem you solve? Blind, aware, exploring, define. That's it. Put them on the grid. Then, and this part matters, sanity check your placement with signals, right? What changed in the last 30, 60, 90 days? What pressure is visible from outside? What movement is happening internally? What behavior suggests accelerate or hesitation? You'll notice something immediately. Most of your priority accounts will cluster in places that explain why nothing is happening. And a smaller set, sometimes uncomfortably small, will light up as actually capable of moving. That's the moment this stops being a framework and starts being a mirror. Because now you have a choice. You can keep pretending volume equals progress, or you can accept that precision beats optimism. Here is what usually happens when teams do this honestly. Target list gets shorter and shorter, campaigns get sharper and sharper, sales stops rolling their eyes, pipeline conversation become calmer, because fewer things are mysterious. And something else changes too, something personal, right? You stop behaving like a marketer whose job is to generate activity. You start behaving like an operator whose job is to read reality and act accordingly. That's the identity shift this entire series is about. The 99% are still running personas, empathy maps, and annual ICP decks. Right? They're trying to sound customer centric. The top 1% are doing something quieter and far more dangerous. They are building systems that understand how organizations actually move. If this episode forced you to rethink how you target, good. That discomfort is the signal you're upgrading. I'll see you in the next episode. Until next time, cheers.